scientists.
My training is mainly as a historian. It was already mentioned that I work on Christian origins and especially texts and how to interpret those texts. And I sort of stumbled or groped my way toward cognitive science because some of the questions that I wanted to answer couldn't be answered with the normal approaches that I had been using, especially anthropology. Even though it's been very helpful. So you'll see from my abstract that I'm interested, in a way it continues with Tom's presentation, but not the contrast between religion and science, rather between humanities and sciences. There's talk of, the word conciliation gets used a lot, that there's a single truth we're all trying to probe from our various perspectives. But we really do move in different ways. And I've found in working with this relatively new subdiscipline of cognitive science of religion that it's hard for the hard scientists and the humanities people to talk to each other about the common topic. And so that's what's in the background for me. This morning as I'm talking. It's exciting for you to be in a relatively new discipline, for all of you who are studying it. And my thoughts today are partly with you in mind. What is it like for you to be helping to form this discipline, to be figuring out what it's about, how to approach it, what interdisciplinary work is necessary to make it happen? And to really, I hope today, also be thinking about how humanities and sciences can work together productively. I think that as you continue on, cooperation with colleagues is going to be essential to your work. No one of us can be expert enough in all of the areas we need to be in order to study something like religion, for instance, something as complex and multifaceted as religion. So it's really going to take interdisciplinary work and cooperative work, teamwork, not solo work, to crack this egg. Anyway, when I make presentations, I have an official title, and you see this one, Religious Experience in the Wild. It's been studied in labs to an extent, but I'm interested in what does it look like out there when it's happening. But I also have secret titles, almost always, for my presentations. So the secret title today has to do with these four. We really don't. Not yet when it comes to religion. I want to commend to you, in particular, Russell and the little girl as the right approaches to take here to really getting at what is the cognitive science of religion. I need to switch slides, don't I? Okay. So, cognitive science of religion, CSR. It really has had its origins, this subdiscipline, somewhere around the 90s. The 1990s. A lot of people talk about an article written by Dan Dennett. But Pascal Boyer is really one of the figures who, in the first place, tried systematically to think about what cognitive science might have to say about religion. And his book, Explaining Religion, says a lot about what the emphasis is in this approach. This book by Bob Macaulay is probably the most recent one that's been published from this group of people working on CSR, on cognitive science of religion. And the title, Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not, tells you a lot about the general perspective of this group. Science takes focused thought, takes counterintuitive exercise of reason, whereas religion, they argue, is completely natural. It is a folk concept in a way. So they, within CSR, people aren't so much interested in what I might call elite religion, or they aren't interested in the sages and how the sages come to their insight. They're interested more in folk religion, in superstitions, in the stuff that comes up normally, and in all of the ways that religion is a byproduct of normal human processes. So, for instance, there have been studies by Justin Barrett, who I mentioned a moment ago, on theological incorrectness. And some of those studies looked at people who were completely well enculturated in their own religious tradition, and they had ideas about God, that God was omniscient, omnipresent, and so on, all the orthodox ideas about God. But in these experiments, when they were put sort of in real-time online religious thinking, they didn't reflect their well-formed theology. In fact, they were given a story about someone who, I think their leg was caught under rocks in a river, and they were praying for help. They were praying that they would be saved, and nothing was happening. And the people in the experiment asked, well, why is nothing happening? And they would routinely say things like, well, God's busy right now. And so they abandoned, in online thinking, they abandoned their higher order theological correctness and thought about God completely anthropomorphically. This is what they call theological incorrectness. So that's the kind of thing that's been studied. In addition, CSR is very interested in explaining religion, not understanding it in that bigger sense, certainly not in interpreting it, but in explaining how it arises. And I've already mentioned that one of the emphases is these innate cognitive capacities. So there's a lot of attention to folk intuitions, what Bob Macaulay, the author of the book on the slide, calls maturationally natural thinking. So, for instance, children without special training just come to have biological intuitions that like produces like. A sunflower seed will produce another sunflower, not a puppy. But religion exploits violations of these intuitions, so that religious ideas tend to include what they call moderately counterintuitive constructions, where folk intuitions are mixed together or violated in interesting ways. So again, these are the kinds of things that have been studied. And evolution is emphasized really highly in these explanations as well. One of the primary points of difference right now among these folks is whether religion is adaptive or if it's just this big mixed salad of byproducts. Bob Macaulay is the mixed salad variety of arguer, but many others understand religion not to have been an adaptation. It is a byproduct, but an exaptation. Its capacities that evolved for other reasons are used by religion in an adaptive way. And primarily the argument is that it's pro-social, oftentimes. This is one of the main avenues of investigation here. Finally, in CSR, one other emphasis is to design empirically measurable studies of religion and cognition. So there's a strong emphasis on the science end and a strong emphasis on lab experimentation, on quantification, and so on. So what we get in this fledgling discipline then is a lot of talk about beliefs and a lot of talk about ideas, a little bit of talk about ritual, not much talk about embodiment, strangely, except possibly through ritual, not much talk about emotion. And also, some things are really, for something like religion that is this lived, hairy thing embedded in a culture, it's really hard to test that in a laboratory. Especially the kind of thing I'm interested in, which is religious experience. Now, there have been some really interesting attempts to study more naturally aspects of religion. For instance, there's the idea that part of what makes ritual adaptive is prosociality. So one of the experiments just had, it's always undergrads, friends, it's always undergrads, a room full of undergrads, moving arms in unison, just meaningless behavior, but in unison. Because the idea was here that synchrony is part of what's so interesting about ritual, bodies moving in time, voices coordinated. So people just mirroring each other's behavior. And then after they did that, and also a control group where their behavior wasn't in sync or people could move randomly and so on. And after that, they played economic games where you know these, where you have to either win the most money you can or cooperate and win. You know these economic games, yes? Because I'm not describing it very coherently. Anyway, it's the test to see, is prosociality, is cooperation increased simply by moving synchronously? Really interesting experimental design and some interesting results. But is that religion? It's a small aspect. It's great that it's being tested. It's fabulous, and it adds to the information. It helps us to continue to move forward on exploring things. But it's not quite religion, maybe. So for me, then the question of religious experience is where it really doesn't seem like we can do well testing it in a lab. Michael Persinger at Sudbury you've probably heard about the God helmet. And those experiments haven't been replicated by others who've tried them. So the idea was that I think it's the left temporal lobe. Does anyone else know that that's correct? Yeah, left temporal lobe. So you wear a helmet, you get your left temporal lobe stimulated, and you see God. Was the gist of this experiment. It had all sorts of problems with priming, of course, and a number of experimental errors. So that's one way it's been tested. In Aarhus in Denmark, they're doing interesting experiments with fMRI and prayer, listening to authoritative voices, those sorts of things. But I want to tell you two stories about religious experience in the wild, just to give you a sense of what's different. Is there water somewhere? Thanks, Jesse. 2.5 years ago, my father died, and he had been a heavy smoker for much of his life and really wrecked his lungs. So towards the end of his life, he was on steroid inhalers, and he was having a hard time breathing. But we got a phone call one day that he had had a heart attack. And my siblings, thank you very much. My siblings and my mom and I all went to the hospital, and we saw him before he went in for surgery. We assumed it was going to be bypass surgery. They had done the tests and seen that his arteries were really heavily blocked. It was probably going to be quadruple bypass. So he went in for surgery, and we all waited in the hospital, and they came to tell us that it hadn't been what they had expected, and his arteries were blocked. But in fact, he had apparently had multiple small heart attacks over the past few years that were masked by his lung problems. And his heart muscle was more or less destroyed, and they didn't think that he would recover from the surgery. So after they told us that, we went into the room where he was now not recovering, but placed. And it was quite a shock to walk in. He wasn't conscious, of course, and in fact, they were sedating him to keep him unconscious. I think that there were 3 monitors attached to him, one that was measuring the medication going into him, one measuring his heart and respiration and so on. I have no idea about the third. So lots of tubes in his arms. But the most shocking thing was that because they knew the surgery wasn't successful and weren't sure what would happen next, they hadn't closed up his chest. There was a piece of latex across the opening of his chest. And so when we came in, it was that the trauma to his body was really, really evident. And he was lying there, and eventually the grandchildren all came as well, so we were close to 20 people in the room, and nobody had unfinished business with him. He had lived a really good life, so it was just sadness and love in the room, and that was lovely. But his body was so obviously beaten up. There was no getting around that, and we very quickly came to the decision that it would be best to disconnect all of those supports. But at some point while I was standing there, and we'd been laughing and crying, and I was looking at him, I had what I'm going to call a religious experience. And I've had to, after the fact, try to find a word, a sentence for it, but that wasn't at all what it was. It was a kind of knowing that wasn't propositional, wasn't discursive, but the only way I could describe it was to say that as I was looking at that body, that broken body, I thought, this body is my father. It doesn't do justice to it in any way possible, but I was filled with the bliss of a life I had had with a loving dad, with the fact that even though he wasn't present in the way we normally talk about it, that body was him. And it was a beautiful experience for me. So the second story I want to tell you is from the 1st century. And it's the person who Tom mentioned earlier, who is someone I study a lot. I think people know him as the Apostle Paul, so he was a Jewish man in the 1st century, and he had lived his life with quite a bit of zeal. He was probably, you could have considered him a fundamentalist. And in fact, he spent a lot of his time, he writes about it in one of his letters. These letters survive from him, first-person accounts of his life. And in one of them, he talks about how he lived with fundamentalist zeal. He was persecuting people who disagreed with him. And then he just says simply, but when God chose to reveal Christ in me. And that's all he says about his religious experience in that letter. Elsewhere, he talks about visions. This was a person who had multiple religious experiences. And he says, and because of that, I changed. The things that mattered don't matter anymore. This has traditionally been described as a conversion, and people use the word conversion as if that will take care of everything that needs to be said about that event. But I've started to wonder if this is really something that would be better described as an insight, a religious insight. It's also in that letter that he says, and because of this, all this that has been revealed, because of this religious experience and his trust in it, there is no more, and it was the passage Tom quoted, no more Judean or Hellenist, two groups that were dead set against each other, no more male nor female, no more slave or free, but there's this oneness in the identity. It was a profound religious insight for his time. Other people had talked about it at the time. A lot of people were aware that there should be movement toward a kind of a human oneness, but very few people rearranged their lives to act on it. Very few people had such a change, cognitive, emotional, personal change, that they devoted themselves to that insight, which is a basic religious or even humanist insight, that all of humanity is equal. So how do we talk about those things? How do we figure out what it is that happens in that kind of religious insight? Is it appropriate to call both of these events religious? Is what I experienced in the hospital religious? what makes what he experienced religious? Wasn't he more religious before the event than he was after? And what's experience? We've got two vague terms, we combine them, it doesn't really help us very much. So one of the ways in then is to begin to look at consciousness and the structure of consciousness. So I want to now walk you through a couple of experiments done in this case, in both cases by social psychologists. The first two are Travis Prull. He's now at Tilburg, but he was at UBC during the experiment I'm going to describe to you, and Stephen Hine. And together they're working, especially Prull, but together they're working on what they call a meaning maintenance model. These two are interested in a whole range of phenomena about how people make and maintain meaning through schemas, paradigms, and scripts. And they've been looking at the ways that, in fact, we're often unaware of goal-directed behavior until it's blocked somehow, that we often aren't even aware of our intentions in this way and the way we're trying to make meaning. Now, there are often violations to our scripts, to our meaning-making schemas. We've had one this week, right, with the shooting of Corporal Nathan Cirillo. And most people are able to deal with this violation of expectations either through normal accommodation or through assimilation. We accommodate our meaning making to the violation. People who are emphasizing, well, Canada isn't as safe as I thought it was. Thankfully, not very many people are saying that. They are doing the accommodation. Or we assimilate people who are emphasizing how brave and important his work was, standing in front of a monument, are trying to assimilate so that the meaning making isn't violated by this unexpected event. But sometimes it's not possible to do that conscious work of accommodation or assimilation. And Prull and Hine have been very interested in that. Our need to keep balance in the world, when something is taken away, when one of the principles by which we navigate our lives is taken away, there's this very, very strong impulse to compensate for that somehow. Cognitive dissonance is an example of this, but they looked at a few other things. And you can see here a quote from them, that the schemas people affirm in meaning maintenance efforts can be functionally interchangeable with one another, even though they may differ in content, function, or conscious activation. They're really interested in the weird ways we compensate. And so they designed an experiment that they called the transmogrifying experimenter. And basically, the structure is, first, they had done a few of these experiments beforehand. They would give students, again, undergrads, questionnaires that were rigged so that all of the questions were sort of negative about the possibilities of making a good life. They got them to talk about feelings of alienation and so on. Got them to read absurdist literature, so Kafka, or Waiting for Godot, or look at surrealist art. And then they gave them a chance to answer questionnaires in which they could punish a wrongdoer, or they could criticize someone who had insulted their country. And all of the students who had gone through these meaning disruptions were way harder on the people in the questionnaires than were the students in the control group. So in the experiment I want to describe to you, there were 81 subjects, and they were divided into 3 groups: control, the control group, the changing experimenter group, and the mortality salience group. So all of them came in and to fill out opinion surveys, and the first 2 groups were both given an entertainment preference survey to start off with. And the third group was given a questionnaire about death and dying to try to trigger the meaning problems. And then after they had that initial task, the control group just went on to read a hypothetical account of a prostitute who was arrested, and they had to assign what level the bond should be set at for her. The changing experimenter group also filled out that same survey, but only after this happened. This is the lab, and I'm going to just play a little video clip in a minute. You can see, will my mouse show? No. The young woman in the foreground is filling out one of the surveys, and the woman with her back to us is a grad student experimenter. She's part of the experiment. So watch and see if you can see what they did. I don't think the sound doesn't matter. Okay, that's it. Did you notice? They switched experimenters. Watch it again. They're so wily. Wait, I might not be able to play it again. It might just go to the next slide. Yeah. Okay. Pretty nifty, eh? Okay, 3 of the 81 people noticed. But all of the people, or I'm sorry, not all 81 were in this condition, but 3 of the people in this condition noticed. Here are the 2 women who participated. They don't really look that much alike. They were dressed completely the same, and that was the thing. So I say 3 noticed, but in fact all noticed. Because afterward they asked them about setting the bond for the prostitute. And here you can see the 3 conditions. The control group that just filled out the survey on entertainment and then filled out the survey on the prostitute. And then we have the changing experimenter group and the mortality salience group. And you see how much higher they set the bond. And this is part of a whole set of experiments that show the way you can substitute a completely different script in cases where meaning making has been disrupted, that you look for any way to sort of solidify your worldview, and you'll take what comes to hand. This kind of experiment is very interesting for jury selection and all that sort of thing. But do you follow the experimental design? No? Yes? We can go over it in the question period if it's not completely clear. So for people in the control group, a relatively low level of bond was set. The prostitute isn't punished that much for her behavior. But for the people who either had ideas of death stimulated, which has been proven in many, many experiments to cause this sort of disruption of meaning making, or the people who, even though they didn't consciously notice, experienced a morphing of their experimenter, a disruption to their perception, those people too set the bond for the prostitute higher. There's this effort to reestablish stronger meaning to compensate for the loss of it in a completely different sphere. So in some ways, this is here's the more punitive reactions were in these 2 cases of meaning disruption. In some ways, this is the bad news of our consciousness. The way in which there's a book called Strangers to Ourselves. The way in which our goals and motivations are often masked from our own attention, but are functioning nonetheless. So for the good news, we go to Ap Dijksterhuis, a Dutch, again, social psychologist. He's interested in decision making. And the way in which deliberation does or doesn't help in decision making. And my slide is not changing. There we go. So distinctions between conscious and non-conscious processing. And they set up a number of experiments to test this, mainly about making decisions about very complex tasks. So, for instance, choosing an apartment. And they got their requisite crew of undergrads to come in. And they had 4 apartments, one that was clearly but not overwhelmingly the best one, one that was clearly the worst, and then 2 that were neutral. There were 8 characteristics for each apartment, and they scrolled across a screen for a limited period of time. And then people were, again, divided into 3 groups. One group was invited to make the decision right away. So they've tested how many bits of information people can handle in working memory, and I think it was 32. So that's the number of characteristics that they were given in total about these 4 apartments. So one group, shown the characteristics sliding across, had to make their decision about which apartment they wanted right away. The second group, the second and third groups were each given 3 to 4 minutes before they made their judgment. One group deliberated. They had 3 to 4 minutes to think about it, to try to decide which is the best one. And the third group was given a distraction task, solving anagrams, or something that required their full conscious attention. So, which group, you know it's an interesting result, or I wouldn't be asking you, but what's your guess about which group made the best decision? The group that decided right away, the group that deliberated, the group that was distracted and then decided? Sorry? Distracted group. I mean, it's a good mystery story. It's got to be the distracted group, but have you got any idea why? That's the part that's bewildering, yes? Right, okay, I don't know if you all heard that, but that's basically the result, that this amount of information doesn't work well with conscious thought. So what was required for a successful decision was not just that there was time to process, but that the people were prevented from consciously processing. The people who consciously process did more poorly in their choice than the people who were prevented from consciously processing. And so Dijksterhuis and the people he's working with are interested in the split between conscious processing and that non-conscious processing has way more room, much larger capacity, can handle more information more effectively, is their hypothesis that they're continuing to test out. And the conscious mind is much more directed to solving immediate problems in the immediate environment. It's very good at that. And in fact, through evolution, we've developed so that again, survival, so that conscious attention can be focused on immediate threats. We also tend to fixate in conscious thought so that it's hard to get new scripts in. I'm sure you've been introduced to some of this in classes. So here are some of their results. And this is a different experiment than the one I described. This one was on cars. And you can see that in one case, they were given limited information. Here on the leftmost side, just 4 pieces of information. And with 4 pieces of information, conscious thinking is actually better. The white bar is for conscious attention, and the black is for distraction. So they did better with less information. And then beside it, you see with 12 pieces of information, the non-conscious processing is much more effective. The table beside it shows satisfaction, which is another whole interesting level to this. How happy were they with their choice after they made it? And again, you can see the differences. So part of what this experiment points to in terms of consciousness is the way in which there's, so what we're looking at is a lot going on behind the veil, right? A lot that we're not aware of, processing that's happening without us knowing. When it comes to our attention and when it doesn't is really interesting and is part of what goes on in religious experiences and these insight. The other category that we can use to consider religious experiences, alterations of consciousness, and here it's anthropologists who help. This is an old picture of Erica Bourguignon, who did her main work in the 60s. And she helped to coordinate a group of anthropologists who looked through all of the available field reports on religions throughout the world. And they found that in 80% of the world's populations, there was some form of altered states of consciousness that was practiced, that was part of a religious practice, 80% of the world's populations. And Bourguignon focused primarily on the idea of trance states. Who uses trance states? Why do they use them? Where do they show up? And they were working with big data. For the first time, they had all sorts of details so that they could coordinate not only these practices of trance within individuals, but they could coordinate those with social conditions, with political conditions. They could begin to look at correlations between these elements. Since then, Michael Winkelmann, he looks like an anthropologist, doesn't he? You could see him out in the field, gamely. I'm going to stop. He continued to work with Bourguignon's details and started to try to systematize what he called magico-religious practitioners, tried to further coordinate all of these details together. Now, one of the results of this work was a distinction, and this had always been around in anthropological literature, a distinction between shamanism and spirit possession. These are two sets of people who both practice trance of some kind. And the list you have here is a bit of a mix of what anthropologists call emic and etic categories, the way an outsider would describe it and the way an insider would describe it. It's really interesting to see that it appears to be two different neurological experiences going on here. And the signs of that are the displacement of memory, the amnesia that is part of spirit possession, whereas the retention of memory in shamanism practices. And the involuntary, I've talked a little bit about the body, but spirit possession, it tends to include much more involuntary bodily movement and twitching and so on. So it appears here that we've got two different neurological capacities and two different social functions, two different roles within societies that are structured around these different practices of altered states of consciousness. Shamans tend to be the sages in their communities, and spirit-possessed people tend to be of lower status. Here you can see some of the integration that Winkelmann did. And part of what I find quite interesting is the societal conditions. Now, this is describing places where these practices are protected or recognized or honored in some way. Shamanic practices tend to be in more isolated communities, nomadic, without political integration with other sets of communities. Whereas medium, which is the spirit possession category, tends to show up in highly stratified societies where there's a lot of difference between elite and non-elite, high status and low status, and societies where there's integration across groups. There's political integration across groups. So what we're starting to see is is what I've been calling multi-level explanation, that it's not enough to consider the individual and the structure of consciousness and the capacity for trance states, but that here we're also having to look at social structure, the organization of societies, the kind of needs that the societies have, and the way in which religious practices can serve those or not. Spirit possession tends to show up in colonized countries, which is very interesting. In North Africa, now I've completely lost the name of the Algerian psychiatrist, activist, Fanon, thank you, Frantz Fanon. He documented a really high increase. So when Algeria was colonized by France, suddenly there was this outbreak of spirit possession, almost as a religious technology of resistance, that people who are oppressed by powers that they can't overthrow subvert them in a way through the experience of a power that's stronger than the colonizing one. It doesn't change the circumstances. It's not effective in overthrowing them, but it's effective in surviving under them. So we start to get the interplay of all sorts of features, and here's where I think we might legitimately begin to call something religion. When it's integrated in this way into the interplay of all of these factors. So if we look again at my man Paul, and this is someone's interpretation of one of his visions. Poor little cherubs. It's a lot of work. He's just beholding the beatific vision, and they're like, so, history. What do we need to try to describe a phenomenon like this? Thick descriptions of historical political conditions. So now I'm just talking at the level of explanation, the sort of stuff CSR does. Psychology and neuroscience, testing of structures of consciousness. And again, I think there's really interesting neuroscientific work being done, especially out of Aarhus. If you are looking for a place to watch, Uffe Schut is one person who's doing very interesting work. Joseph Bubulia and his co-experimenters also. Anthropology, to get the relevant ethnographic databases, to get the appropriate categorization. Evolutionary biology. And here it's, again, what's happening in these cultures in terms of competition between societies, in-group, out-group competition? In what ways can evolutionary biology help us? I would put emotion in this category as well, the idea of appraisal systems that are integrated in emotional worlds. But then I'd like to argue also that we need philosophy, religion, and cultural criticism. So here, back to the idea of the humanities, the evaluation of meaning-making projects. We can describe religion, we can explain it as a product of evolution, a byproduct. But what makes people seek it out? What makes it effective? What makes it a positive force? And it's also obviously a very negative force. What makes it powerful in human history? And here I think we need to think about integrating humanities into the ways we talk about these things for the past and for the present. If we think about movements of emancipation, I would count Paul as part of a movement of emancipation away from strong ethnic difference and ethnic infighting. We could add lots of religious figures to this. Moses, Martin Luther King, Martin Luther. all of them in one way or another responding to social circumstances of their time, and all of them affected by experiences of religious insight. The shamanistic version, even if their societies didn't support shamanism. There is a, I hope you recognize the illusion in this picture. There's a cultural critic named Slavoj Žižek. He's an atheist, but he's an atheist who argues powerfully that religion is a category necessary to society. And the reason he argues it is because he says, again, even though he doesn't think there is any such thing as a God, and that therefore religion is false in its assumptions, he argues that religion is the only thing that can protect the category of ultimacy from false claims to ultimacy. And he says that's necessary to the health of societies. This, of course, is a bit of Occupy Wall Street here on the slide. We have, in our lifetimes, even those of you who are significantly younger than me, lived through two events where it would have been really wonderful to have some deeper reflection on what was going on. One is 9/11, and the other is the crash of the markets in 2008. Societies come to points of profound distortion, and it's in part of what I'm trying to point to here is that it's in those points of profound distortion that there's often been a religious figure with a profound religious experience who somehow is able to articulate an emancipation from what that distortion is. We didn't have that in either of these cases. I was actually naive enough in 2008 when, everything came crashing down and the financial markets were broken. I thought, finally we'll see it's broken. I really thought we're going to change, and we haven't at all. If we think about, is that funny? You're laughing so you don't cry? Is that that's how I feel about it. Think about the way, if we revert to religious language, there's every reason to call the economy an idol, right? It's, why are we doing things? Well, the economy needs it. The economy will suffer if we don't. It's alive. It demands our adherence. We must sacrifice to the economy, right? It's religious, completely religious language. And there is now, in increasing secularism, what can counter it? This isn't an argument pro or con religion. It's the observation that it's been religion that's held off other claims to that category of ultimacy. And it's been this cultivation of insight, the possibility to look deep within a tradition and to call on other forms of wisdom, and to have a space where that can be offered as an alternative that's missing. So we have George Bush say, you're either for us or against us, and we have a series of wars that have resulted. Instead of someone saying, let's lament what's broken, let's mourn what's lost, let's pause in the pain. And so that's part of the reason I think religious experience still matters. Thank you.